Hey everybody, I hope you've had a good week. Good job on the welcome videos. And today's video begins with the trade approach. So let's jump in, and in this video I'll go through the leadership process model, which is the basis of the class, and then explain the trade approach and how it works, some strengths, criticisms, and describe how the trade approach fits into the leadership process model. I won't go over all that Nordhaus does or the articles, so you will need to read those so that you can learn it through the quiz and then have that information available for your discussion time and also the reflection. I'll finish the video section talking about how you can fill out your theory matrix given the trade approach, and that will provide the example for how you do your theory matrix each week so that you can stay up to date and caught up on that matrix, because you'll use that for your case studies and you'll use it for your final concept map at the end of the term. So let's go to the leadership process model first. And you have already been wrestling with what is leadership and how does it differ from management, and how does it differ from power, and how does the leadership and leadership process work. So this is a model by Dunham and Pearce, who through research and study drew a model that described the leadership process. And the way they described it is that leadership is a dynamic, interactive, sometimes complex process between the leader, the follower, the context, the leadership process or ways of influence, and then the outcomes or results. So in any situation or organization, there is this process of all five of these elements that help a person, and usually a leader, assess and determine what good leadership is and how they can lead. And the leader and follower, we understand there's things we'll learn about them this term. And then, of course, the context, that could be formal or informal. It could be an organization, a nonprofit, such like the Friendship Home, or it could be a family-owned business or a restaurant. It could be a sports context, like a basketball court or a football field. And then there's the ways of influence. For example, in ALEC 102, one of the ways of influence we learned is interpersonal skills. And many of you identified some key interpersonal skills and elements that are part of your own personal leadership influence philosophy. And then there's outcomes. So there are other components to this process besides interpersonal skills, like tasks and relationship building. And then there's outcomes. So leadership and understanding how to lead is a complex process of all of these. And what we're going to look at today is the trade approach. And the trade approach is very leader-centered. It's an approach that explains the role that traits have in this leadership process and how traits can be used to aid the leader and are an expression of leadership. So we're going to come back to this model at the end, but let's just give a brief overview of the trait process. The trait process is one of the first systematic attempts to study leadership. It goes way back, even early 1900s, where leadership was thought to be connected to great men, or great people, such it was the great man theories, and that was identifying innate qualities, characteristics that distinguished leaders from followers, and those characteristics were in great social and political military leaders like Abraham Lincoln or Gandhi or Napoleon, and those were considered leaders. Over the century, through research, various individuals began to see leadership as more interactive and involving multiple traits and personality characteristics, and even that some characteristics were very effective in some circumstances or contexts, but not effective in others. And so these were some of the lists of characteristics that different researchers found through multiple studies were characteristic of leaders in a variety of contexts. And what Nordhaus does is he shows how looking at a lot of those different traits, there were some commonalities over that century that consistently distinguished leaders from followers. And he summarizes it in 5: intelligence, self-confidence, determination, integrity, sociability. So it's good to examine ourselves as to which of these we have and how we might pursue some of them. They're traits that characterize leaders. In the last 25 years, many traits have been grouped together in major personality categories. This one of the most common, known as the Big Five personality factor, where characteristics are grouped together in 5 groups: neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And research has shown us that all 5 of these are consistently associated with leaders in a variety of contexts, such that the trait approach would argue that leaders have these qualities. For example, some research shows that people recognize leaders by their extroversion, that tendency to be sociable and assertive and have positive energy. And other research shows that effective leaders are very conscientious, and they have a tendency to be thorough and organized, controlled, dependable, decisive. So, but all of these in various ways are associated with leadership. So the way the trait leadership approach works then is the trait approach exclusively focuses on the leader, on the traits that leaders exhibit and who has those traits. And it would argue that effective leadership is having certain traits. And depending on what environment or context you would like to be a good leader, then you need to want to develop certain kinds of traits. Now, this approach gets used, though not often described this way, in companies. They will make trait assessments. Human resources will, as to hiring. They want to hire certain kinds of people or hire people with certain personality characteristics. And companies even more so will use personality tests to help sort through the applicants and hire people. It's also used in personal awareness and development. And what we're talking about here is personality tests, and you take them and try to understand personality characteristics and traits that you have, and whether you can be an effective leader in situations by having those traits. And so this approach has some strengths to it. Intuitively, we recognize that leaders are different in that they have they possess traits that followers don't possess. And intuitively, we come to this maybe in your first leadership assignment or your first leadership class or your first sports team. You identified some personality characteristics with that leader and perhaps began to think those personality characteristics were essential to that kind of leadership. And in many cases, that's correct. This research has a lot of credibility because it's studied thousands of leaders in situations over a century. And so we've learned that leaders do have different traits, and those traits are important. They can be a benchmark. This approach does have some criticisms to it. There's not a definitive list of traits, and it's a bit subjective, or even highly subjective, as you think about which we might differ and discuss the different traits with leaders and what's best needed. And in our discussion board and Canvas, as you have this discussion interact, we may not all agree, and our experiences are different. This approach also doesn't take into account some of the situational effects with leadership, namely followers, and context and circumstances and what might work and how an environment can be adapted to or changed. It focuses primarily on these characteristics are needed here, these are needed here, and what makes a good leader is those characteristics. This approach also doesn't always help with training and development, because in training and development, you're developing for skills, and these are about personality traits. So, but it does have some values, some accuracy to it. And as we jump back to the leadership model that Dunham and Pierce have done, we would then say, okay, what the trait approach argues is that part of what makes this work is the traits of the leader, and it's leader-centric. And therefore, the trait approach would argue, as you want to be an effective leader, it's good for you to think about what are your traits and what are some of the traits you could develop and what are some of the traits that are needed for the context and the environments that you want to lead in and work in. So as we work through this unit, a key piece of this is your theory matrix. And the theory matrix takes the 5 elements of this process model, the leader, the follower, the context, the process, and the outcome. And for each of these approaches fills in, what are the implications for the leader, the follower, the context, process, and so on. And you'll write more in different spots depending on which approach you're taking. But for the trait approach, it would say to the leader that you need to have certain traits, develop certain traits, and that certain traits are needed depending on the circumstance and the context. It doesn't have as much to say about the follower. The context, the trait approach would say that certain traits are more effective in some contexts than others. Depending on whether that context is formal or informal, and it's good to identify what traits go with what context. The process is mostly a one-way process in trait approach. It is the traits of the leader that have an effect upon people and that carry out leadership, and the outcomes entirely wrapped around the leader and the leader's traits and how those traits impact the follower and the context and the outcome. So that is how you would fill in for trait approach, and you'll do that with each different approach at each unit, filling in the theory matrix. So in this unit, you're going to learn about trait approach and take a quiz. We're going to have some discussion about traits. In your personal reflection, you want to wrestle with your own leadership traits and experiences you've had and traits that you found effective, or when you were in experiences where the leader was effective or not effective based upon traits, and how would you assess yourself and leadership by the trait approach. And you'll also fill out a trait questionnaire to help evaluate yourself. So, and again, the trait approach, it's good. And it's one way of helping understand this process. Traits are vital and necessary, but it doesn't account for the whole process. So that is the trait approach. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to text me or email me or Heather. And have a good weekend, and we will talk to you at the next unit.